Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. I'm Patty Fay. This podcast is for physicians or anyone who thinks healthcare needs a transformation led by physicians. License to Lead means that physicians are charged with and must be in charge of guiding the vision, the standards, and the culture of healthcare systems. If you want to join in the conversation or learn more about activating physician leadership, go to license2leadpodcast.com, where you can send me an email or even leave me a voice message. I'd love to hear from you. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the License to Lead podcast, episode number 2. This is Patty Fay. This is a podcast about physician leadership, and License to Lead reflects my belief that physicians are uniquely qualified to lead, and that it's especially important for physicians to be at the helm, guiding the vision, the strategy, the standards, and the tone in healthcare. In the first License to Lead episode, I covered 4 issues that I wanted to get out on the table as a foundation for this podcast. They were, number 1, physicians as professionals and an important difference in leadership practices compared to the other traditional professions. Number 2, the often misunderstood and misrepresented concept of autonomy. Number 3, the corporate practice of medicine doctrine and its intention. And number 4, management antipathy toward physicians that is too often tolerated in healthcare organizations. In this podcast, I'll dive into why. Why are physicians uniquely equipped to pick up the reins, to be the leaders of our medical groups, hospitals, and healthcare systems? There are 3 parts to this episode. In part 1, I'll talk about physician characteristics, leadership characteristics, that is. In part 2, I'll talk about myths about physicians. You know, like physicians are un-herdable cats and lone wolves who can't manage business or finances to save their necks. In part 3, I will present evidence, won't that be refreshing, about physicians' performance in leadership roles. Okay, let's get started with part 1. Part 1, physician leadership characteristics. I'll talk about 5 different leadership traits that physicians have that ought to get you fired up to see a physician in the corner office of your institution. The first one is technical expertise. Physicians are the technical experts in the core business of healthcare. Technical expertise in a profession, also called domain knowledge, is amassed over years of intense formal education and in-depth training and experience. Amanda Goodall, in her theory of expert leadership, says that core employees are the ones who are the experts in the core business. Her examples are the practicing lawyers in a law firm, surgeons in a hospital, or the top designers in a fashion house. Goodall's research and her theory points to the fact that expertise in the core business should be a primary factor that determines top leadership candidates. Being a physician ought to be a key criteria to be considered for top leadership positions in healthcare. Now, isn't that a fascinating reversal of what is often claimed, that top-notch skills as a physician are irrelevant or worse when it comes to managing and leading? Because, as we've been told repeatedly, we're supposed to leave the business stuff to those who know what they're doing, the business school grads. Goodall points out that not only should the top leaders in an organization be experts in the core business of the organization, but they should be highly regarded for their technical expertise. Great docs, in other words. And she says that the most important decision maker, the top executive or CEO, should be among the best experts in the organization's core business. And why is this the case? When the technical experts lead, they're able to be the standard bearers. The CEO sets the standard for the selection of talent, and the CEO can attract that excellent talent. He or she establishes the quality expectations, models it, and is positioned to be a more effective quality enforcer. So the technical experts able to evaluate the performance in the core function of the business and provide feedback about others' performance and circle back and reinforce those expectations. In my experience, physician leaders with outstanding technical expertise are not as likely to be intimidated by the loudest voice or hoodwinked by inaccurate claims that, for instance, quality will be harmed by this product or by the new OR schedule or by some initiative that the docs don't like. Physician leaders are more likely to see the downsides of the toxic high performer, even if that individual is a high revenue generator. Physicians don't suffer from the belief that you have to put up with prima donna physicians. We are well aware that there are superb doctors in all specialties who are kind and respectful team players and high revenue generators. Individuals who have overcome the entrance barriers and clambered up that long on-ramp to become a professional with technical expertise have demonstrated intrinsic motivation. They're in it for the long haul, and they're more likely to be motivated by commitment to their profession and less financially oriented. On this financial note, Goodall, along with a bunch of other leadership experts, point to a short-term financial focus and rocketing CEO salaries as being associated with the shift from domain experts running organizations to people with general business degrees, the professional managers. In healthcare, a large majority of our institutions are run by professional managers, and we'll look more closely at this in the next podcast. So, as the domain experts in healthcare, physician managers and physician leaders give their organizations an important advantage, a crucial advantage, according to Amanda Goodall. The second leadership trait that physicians have is one that fascinates me. You might be hearing it here first. It's tacit knowledge. This is the most important leadership criteria you've probably never heard of. The simplest definition I've read is attributed to Ritesh Kugh, an Australian professor who wrote an article for the Journal of Advanced Management Science, where he said tacit knowledge is intangible, as opposed to explicit knowledge, which is tangible. That's probably clear as mud, so I'll expand on that a bit. Tacit knowledge is capability that you acquire over time by in-depth exposure, and most importantly, by first-hand experience. A simple example is speaking a language. No one can write down how to speak English in a way that would really be of use to someone wanting to learn to speak the language. Even if you're very articulate, with correct grammar and a huge vocabulary, you won't be able to convey the rules, the how. And why is that? It's because we don't even know the rules that we use effortlessly. Tacit knowledge requires time, exposure, and above all, it's experiential. You heard me mention Jeffrey Pfeffer in the last podcast, and he described tacit knowledge as exactly the thing that separates experts from novices. As he says, quote, "In any domain of expertise, by definition, some portion of the expert's knowledge and competence must be tacit, not explainable. It is irreducible to a formula. If you could just jot down the recipe, then the novice could replicate the results. The novices could perform the task as well as experts." Close quote. The experts can't articulate how they accomplish what they accomplish and don't even know that they've got tacit knowledge that would be valuable to others. So how does this relate to the role of physicians as leaders in healthcare? Just as physicians have amassed explicit technical knowledge in medicine, the core business of healthcare, they've also acquired the mother lode of tacit knowledge. They've put in their 10,000 hours becoming technical experts and also acquired deep understanding of the culture and how things work around here. They understand how the work unfolds day to day in healthcare, how people function on the night shifts in the ICU, and why they make the decisions they do, the subtle differences in culture among various professionals, and where the sticking points are in getting things done, and why, and who's the superstar in the medical staff office or in the lab. How do you find the go-to people in each arena? And what time do the cinnamon rolls come out of the oven in the cafeteria? Well, I wish on that last one. I haven't really had a decent cinnamon roll since Grandma Faye whipped up her last batch many decades ago. She left us the recipe, by the way. We 4 siblings all have it, but none of us can come close to creating the heart-unhappy but heavenly cinnamon rolls that I pine for. Grandma Faye was an expert, and she had tacit knowledge that she couldn't articulate for us. Professionals like engineers, lawyers, architects, dentists, veterinarians, in general, are characterized by immersion in their field with extensive testing and training and years of experiential exposure. But none of the other traditional professions compare to medicine's broad and deep enculturation in multiple institutions and departments and venues over a protracted period of time. This is the kind of experience that creates enormous tacit knowledge, a deep familiarity with the core business, which, along with technical expertise in the core business, are critical predictors of a top leader's success. In the other traditional professions, this is a given. So the large national and multinational law firms are run by lawyers, and large engineering firms are run by engineers. Ironically, or maybe disturbingly, at least for the law profession, when non-lawyers promote the idea of business grads leading law firms, they point to medicine as an example to emulate. In 2018, a Chicago-based law firm appointed Angela Hickey, who had been their CFO, to become their CEO. And the exception proves the rule because Ms. Hickey's appointment caused a stir. Here's the headline in the ABA Journal. Quote, law firms hiring CEOs without law degrees reignites debate about turning over the reins to business professionals. Close quote. And here's a sentence from the article that might sound kind of familiar to physicians. Quote, lawyers are trained to be lawyers and not to be business people. Close quote, says Ms. Hickey, who doesn't like the term non-lawyer. So if listeners have buddies or relatives in law, you might forward this podcast on to them. I'm over the top convinced that it would not be a good idea for law, engineering, or architecture to emulate the straits we've gotten into in medicine. So I've talked about technical expertise and tacit knowledge. A third characteristic that, in my opinion, points to a doctor's license to lead is the physician's ability to learn and to adapt. The long and steep on-ramp of medical education is the academic equivalent of Navy SEAL training. It takes a boatload of intrinsic motivation and ability to take the long view, considering the delayed gratification. Doctors have to adapt to changing circumstances, new requirements, new research, new tools, new teams incessantly. As one writer captures it, physicians are trained improvement experts. Now, isn't that a fresh and welcome interpretation of a group who are often referred to as being resistant to change? A fourth characteristic of physicians is that they understand the needs of other people at work. Employee satisfaction research tells us that when experts in the core business are in leadership roles, it's likely to increase employee satisfaction. In a December 29th, 2016 Harvard Business Review article titled, "If Your Boss Could Do Your Job, You're More Likely to Be Happy at Work," the authors wanted to know if it affects employee satisfaction if the boss is a real expert in the core business of the organization. What was the result? Well, the authors stated that even they were surprised by their results. They studied 35,000 employees in the U.S. and Britain and found that employees are far happier when they're led by people with deep expertise in the core activity of the business. And they figured this is because expert leaders are more likely to create the right conditions at work, to hang on to people. In healthcare, physician leaders know what's important to retain excellent physicians and nurses and other staff. And of great interest to me, now get this, Goodall points particularly to the increased likelihood that expert leaders will preserve the autonomy of others at work. They're most likely to, for instance, rein in the controlling nature of people in the human resources realm. Non-experts who don't understand the field are most likely to compensate for the lack of their core business knowledge by implementing rigid procedures and by creating environments with low levels of individual autonomy and by using surveillance measures. On that note, I was mortified to see ICU nurses queue up around a time clock. The ICU work they do is technically and physically demanding, and these superb nurses would queue up waiting to clock in, or as one nurse told me, they'd get started with their work and then set an alarm on their iPhones so that they could go over and clock in on time because, speaking of loss of autonomy and demoralizing monitoring, the nurses would get written up if they clocked in too early. One truly excellent long-term ICU nurse told me how one day at the end of a wild and exhausting shift, a frazzled colleague asked if she would mind helping to transport an unstable patient. Of course, the nurse said she'd help, and she did, but as a result, she ended up clocking out 30 minutes late on that shift. The next day, her manager wrote her up. In other words, her manager put a disciplinary note in her file. This truly excellent ICU nurse who'd spent her entire career at that hospital left 3 months later. She was recruited elsewhere by a former manager who knew her very well and very much appreciated her. A fifth characteristic of physicians that reinforce why they, or we, must pick up the mantle of leadership is the fact that physicians are trusted by the community and patients. This credibility and confidence in the profession of medicine is precious, and we're at great risk of burning up that precious resource even as we burn out our own careers. Because autonomy is a constant backdrop of these License to Lead podcasts, I'll point out that the patient and community's trust and high regard is at least in part based on their belief, not only in the autonomy of the professional to do the right thing for patients, but also a belief in a physician's power. I'll emphasize again, please don't confuse autonomy with tyranny or disrespectful behavior or poor citizenship. That behavior warrants discipline, which, as I mentioned, is best meted out by highly placed physician leaders. But physicians' autonomy and support to do the right thing on behalf of patients is hugely important, and I'd say the physician's autonomy to manage their day, choose their team, and their power to go to bat for patients has been greatly curtailed. It's now contingent on doctors exhausting themselves, leaping over hurdles, often put in place by those who seek to control and monitor in lieu of understanding the core business. In order to preserve the patient's trust, in order to deserve the patient's trust, physicians must act on their license to lead. Okay, that was part 1, physician traits that spell leadership to me. Next, let's debunk a few myths. Part 2, myths about physicians. So, what do we know about the personalities and predilections of these arrogant, money-hungry lone wolves and un-herdable cats who are terrible at managing money, who are not team players, and who are incapable of running a business? So stereotypes pop up whenever there are differences among groups and a we versus them dynamic is set up. Oxytocin mediates both our affiliation for our tribe and the satisfaction we humans feel when we vilify the other. It's all harmless if it's a North Dakotan telling a joke about Montanans, or if it's Coloradans, at least the few who didn't actually come from the West Coast, denigrating Californians. Doctors laugh at stereotypes about different physician specialists. And I'm here to say, the ones about psychiatrists are totally true, but the ones about internists are just vicious. So the jokes can be idle banter, no big deal. But as we all know, stereotypes can harm and can be used to limit people or to justify bad behavior. An example is if a physician stereotype is used to justify a leader's failings. For instance, a conflict-averse executive might express disgust at bad behavior by physicians, but then take themselves off the hook to take action, to have those courageous conversations because, as everyone knows, physicians are arrogant lone wolves. And so, heck, there's nothing you can do. Stereotypes can promote a personal agenda. For instance, a consultant might aim to sell you a compensation program to help incentivize your docs, who are, after all, just in it for the money. 2 of my biggest beefs with physician stereotypes is, number 1, when high-profile physician leaders repeat them and use them as sound bites, and number 2, when consultants or somebody pitching something runs these stereotypes up the flagpole to help sell their products. So let's talk about often repeated myths or stereotypes about doctors. And let's start with stereotype number 1, the lone wolf physician who just cannot get along on a team. Some high-profile physician leaders are guilty of perpetuating this stereotype. I collect examples of people who describe doctors as not being team players or lone wolves or cowboys, and I have a whole file folder full of articles with such quotes by Dr. James Stoller, a highly credentialed pulmonologist at the Cleveland Clinic who heads up their education institute. He refers to physicians as heroic lone healers or cowboys whose medical training, and I quote, conspire against physicians having reflexes for collaboration or followership, close quote. Dr. Stoller, a prolific publisher, packages and repackages his articles in one journal after another, and the same few lines are repeated. endless fractals, each replicating the irresistible phrases heroic lone healer, cowboy, lack of team behavior, even extrapolated authority. And what might that be? Well, that's when we're used to being the boss and we feel entitled. So it extrapolates to stuff like aggressive driving or being mad about having to wait in the line at the grocery store. Honestly, I feel bad if Dr. Stoller is surrounded by such narcissists. But really, does this description pass the sniff test? Do physicians really see themselves as heroic lone healers? What is the non-collaborative heroic lone healer pathway into medicine? How does that stereotypical personality thrive in medical school, which is replete with teams and teamwork, with study teams, cadaver lab teams, and medical care teams during the 3rd and 4th year of med school? Once into internship and residency, physicians have progressive responsibility on rounding teams and surgical teams and ICU teams and multidisciplinary teams. Students and interns and residents change and adapt to new people and new expectations every 4 to 6 weeks, year after year after year. And these are real teams with real patient care responsibilities, not a business school model of reading a case study and then working in a small team to figure out the right answer for next week's class. So is there something innate about docs not playing well with others? Well, let's look at the evidence. A 2016 study using the Temperament and Character Inventory compared a group of 169 U.S. residents in various specialties to the general population and determined that the residents were more cooperative and altruistic than the general population. Okay, fine. That's a small study. Here's a bigger study. A 2018 study in the BMJ evaluated over 2,300 board-certified physicians, 1,400 residents, and 1,300 medical students from around the world using the 5-factor model assessment called the 10-item personality inventory. All 3 groups, the board-certified docs, residents, and the medical students, had the same profile compared to the general population. So the authors concluded that there is a consistent physician personality. And what were those results? The physicians and trainees scored higher on conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness, and lower on neuroticism, and there was no difference in openness to experience. So, based on this evidence, we'd want to replace our arrogant lone wolf description with maybe a Siberian Husky model. Dutiful, smart, works great in a team, good leader, and good follower. I think we should choose and publish interpretations that have some basis in evidence. The American Kennel Club characterizes the Siberian Husky as the friendly hero. Now, there's a description I could endorse. A second stereotype is that physicians have a command and control decision-making style. This is a great example of a fascinating fact, which is that some of these dings against doctors are actually outcomes of business school education, according to the professors who work in the business schools. Listen for those details in podcast number 3. Anyway, Dr. Stoller, in an NEJM Catalyst article, told an interviewer that our clinical training creates a reflex that works against physicians and our decision-making style. That clinical decision-making trains us in the tyranny of the or rather than the genius of the and. This allegedly handicaps physicians in their ability to make the more ambiguous decisions needed on an organizational level. Well, this makes for interesting reading, but do we have any evidence that when compared to the general population or to other professionals or to business school grads that physicians are actually handicapped in this way? I think physicians get ambiguity pounded into them. With each change of attending or team, new rules and new allegiances apply. And with each new discovery or guideline, heck, everything I knew yesterday is wrong. Time to regroup quickly. Another writer, anesthesiologist Edward Mariano, puts it this way. He believes our training positions doctors to be great leaders and decision makers. As he says, physicians must curate available evidence, weigh risks and benefits, share recommendations in life or death situations, and translate technical jargon into understandable language that allows others to participate in the decision-making. He said that as physicians work their way up, a key learning is that the best ideas can come from anyone. Well, Dr. Mariano's interpretation resonates with me. It describes many of the physicians I know. A September 2019 article in Medical Economics, written by John Figueroa, MBA, and Christopher Krubert, MD, MBA, also applauds physician decision-making ability and their aptitude for organizational level nimbleness. No concern here about struggling with the tyranny of the or. These authors said, quote, "This nimbleness, earned from pressure to care for their patients, often on a shoestring budget, gives many physician CEOs the creativity and fortitude to deliver financial results and not skimp on quality," close quote. A very recent article, it was in the January 2020 issue of Harvard Business Review, identifies elements of good judgment that lead to better decision-making. This article made me think physician training and experience, rather than handicapping us, cultivates us to be adept decision makers. Sir Andrew Leakerman points to characteristics like the following: careful listening with a certain skepticism that challenges the information, experience in the relevant field, detachment, and a willingness to question the solutions. Wow, those sound like traits doctors get criticized for. And here, those qualities are presented as some of the factors that can lead to good decision making. Stereotype number 3. Physicians are lousy at managing their money. A June 2019 article titled, quote, "Reasons Why Doctors Can't Manage Money," close quote, attributes our fatal financial flaws to a number of things, like God complexes and splurging after years of deprivation. But thank goodness, the article does go on to reassure physician readers by saying just because doctors have a reputation for being bad with money doesn't mean that they're doomed to a life of debt, or worse, if they seek professional help, close quote. Yes, bingo. The article was on the Investopedia site and had multiple links to all the financial advisors who would help save us from inevitable ruin. So that's marketing. Can't blame them for exploiting a stereotype that seems tailor-made for financial advisors. More annoying is when physicians spout the same non-evidence-based stuff. In June of 2019, James Turner, MD, wrote an online article titled 4 Reasons Why Doctors Are Bad with Money. And there was a live link in its first sentence. I clicked on how bad doctors are with money. Rather than taking me to the data proving this point, the link took me to his website where he was advertising his book on physician finance. A 2015 Nielsen Global Consumer Insight study found that 75% of Americans who make $150,000 a year save money. So compare this to the 93% of physicians who save money, according to the 2019 Medscape report. Medscape provided a lot more detail about how physicians saved and invested, and then hammered home my point with this statement, quote, "Let's trash the belief that doctors can't manage money or invest wisely," close quote. Okay, on the flip side, interestingly, is stereotype number 4, the assertion that docs are greedy and that we are primarily motivated by money. Now, it seems unlikely to me that someone hell-bent on making as much money as possible, who also has enormous drive and academic prowess, and an ability to delay rewards until the cows come home, well, probably even longer than that, would choose a medical career. Okay, so did I lose you in that run-on sentence? Okay, would a greedy little monster smarty pants who could get into any school choose the delayed gratification of medical training, crippling medical school debt, and increasingly an employed model of compensation? Add to that an oath to serve the patients and society, and a work schedule that's harrowing. I don't know. Seems like those sharp cookies slavering for the almighty buck would have sized up the situation and realized that a relatively quick MBA or a degree in investment banking would be a lot more financially fruitful. And here's a nice juxtaposition of data for you to consider now that we're pondering whether physicians are overly financially motivated. A June 2019 Forbes article looked at the highest CEO compensation of not-for-profit systems in the United States. And they named the 6 highest paid CEOs in not-for-profit hospital systems. These 6 highest paid CEOs each made at least $10 million in 2017. Juxtapose that group to the highest performing healthcare organizations, or the best hospitals, as listed by U.S. News and World Reports for 2018-19. The top 5 on that list were Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, Johns Hopkins, Mass General in Boston, and the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. And guess what? There's no overlap between those two groups. So not one of these CEOs with a supersized salary was in charge of a top 5 best hospital. And none of these super salaried CEOs were physician CEOs. And how about the CEOs of the top 5 best hospitals? Well, glad you asked. They were all physician CEOs. In the next podcast, I'll dive deeper into the connection between business school background and ideology and these ludicrous CEO compensation packages in all kinds of industries, and also the association with poorer business outcomes. Stereotype number 5. This is the one about physicians not being suited to lead or not capable of running a business. Here's one that really doesn't resonate with me personally. In my first podcast, I talked about that superb doc who I had helped recruit and who ended up being one of the first physicians to exercise his option and jump ship when the culture got nasty and punitive. He left and started a successful and innovative organization. 20 years later, it is still physician-led and has won multiple Best Place to Work awards. My husband, a neurologist, is the founder of a 6-physician intraoperative monitoring company with simply outstanding neurologists, a terrific reputation, providing intraoperative monitoring services in 10 states. 2 of his neurologist colleagues were clear that they would only work in a physician-run organization. In my coaching practice, I work with 3 physician leaders who are among the 3 most capable leaders I've ever met of any background. They're all quick studies, lovely human beings, and accomplished in operations, strategy, budget and finance, growth, report generation, navigating politics, public speaking. And I realize my examples are just anecdotes, but I am saving the data for part 3 of this podcast. I suppose stereotypes are inevitable in complex organizations, especially when there are lots of layers and silos. But again, for me, it is really painful when doctors repeat myths. Like this one. Dyke Drummond, who blogs as the Happy MD, and who is unbelievably prolific with a newsletter and a book, and he has a consulting and speaking career. One of his posts was Physician Leadership Skills, 3 reasons doctors make poor leaders and what you can do about it. Ouch. And when a reader posted a comment asking him what he thought of the HBR article, Why the Best Hospitals Are Managed by Doctors, he responded, because the best hospitals hire physician CEOs. So he didn't ascribe the excellent results to the physician leaders. He implied that the systems were good, so they chose to hire physician CEOs. But actually, the best of the best have always been physician-led, like Mayo Clinic and the Cleveland Clinic, numbers 1 and 2 on the U.S. News and World Report list. They were founded by physicians, and they've been physician-led since their inception. It's hard to blame the Happy MD too much. These myths are in the water we swim in, right? But the evidence doesn't support such nonsense. The last section of today's podcast will review the evidence we do have. But before we get there, I want to talk about, why does any of this matter? Why so touchy about these stereotypes? Aren't they just harmless labels? You know, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Wait, what? Words will never hurt me? I'll address that fallacy. I'll give you the real dirt on that ditty in my 2020 neuroscience episode. But here are reasons non-evidence-based physician stereotypes are a problem. Number 1, it makes the physician leadership role unattractive. Most of us want to step into roles that offer the promise of a high-performing team. If physician leaders are denigrated, why would anyone want to be a part of that? Number 2, leaders who believe these stereotypes create a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think people have to be closely monitored, or if you believe that all docs are arrogant, you create an environment where the people who fulfill those expectations, or the people who can tolerate those conditions, are the only ones who will stick around. And number 3, these stereotypes take leaders off the hook to listen and to be respectful of dissenting voices. If the executive team believes that physicians are arrogant and don't tolerate change, then when there's resistance to a dysfunctional EMR or poor attendance at a tone-deaf meeting to address burnout, the leaders can just shake their heads in disgust at the docs who won't, get on board. Number 4, It enables avoidance of two of the most important tasks of managing a culture. First, excellent selection, and second, courageous performance management. If a leader believes that physicians are inherently difficult to deal with, they're probably not going to screen out the jerks when they're recruiting. Then the double whammy ensues. The haphazard selection results in a toxic hire, and leaders then can dodge the difficult work when it's time to address that behavior. A conflict-averse leader can just say, hell, I'm not going to talk to her about her snarky attitude. She's not nearly as bad as the endocrinologist who punched a hole in the wall. And then guess what? Again, the very best docs and nurses jump ship because the best of the best have lots of options. And none of them, none of us, want to hang out with arrogant lone wolves who aren't team players. The fifth reason is when we accept physician stereotypes, we're not only shooting ourselves in the foot, but we're rejecting our own commitment to be evidence-based. And then finally, the sixth reason is these dings against docs just don't jive with my personal experience. I know that's not the highest order of evidence, but I'm surrounded by physicians, and I find kindness, commitment, collaboration, and respectful behavior to be overrepresented among physicians. Think about your physician colleagues. Are terms like arrogant, non-collaborative, change-averse, bad with money over or underrepresented? And of course, by stressing over or underrepresented, it implies that you are considering some kind of comparison group. That's important. More on that in a bit. So, how about those stinkers? Those high-profile physician leaders who use stereotypes for sound bites? A great, i.e. terrible, example is an HBR article by Thomas Lee and Toby Cosgrove titled Engaging Doctors in the Healthcare Revolution. So, Dr. Lee is a phenomenally accomplished physician leader and prolific author, and Dr. Cosgrove, a thoracic surgeon, was the longstanding CEO of Cleveland Clinic, a prolific author, a decorated Vietnam veteran. You get the picture. They're amazing. Well, the thrust of their article was how it was possible to use 4 specific motivational techniques to engage physicians in the healthcare revolution. I didn't like the title or the whole premise. I just knew I was going to run into something in there about needing to get the doctors on board. They described doctors as anxious, struggling, in denial, and mourning about change. They said unmasking performance data can be excruciating for physicians. I thought that was kind of embarrassing. They invoked carrots and sticks by saying physicians, like everyone else, are motivated by financial incentives. And they double down on that with a sidebar giving us the how-tos of creating incentives. I'll talk more about incentives in later podcasts, but incentives as a constructive engagement strategy should have died in 1993 when Elfie Cohen wrote Punished by Rewards. The authors go on to say physician engagement requires more than merely an agreement not to sabotage. I first read this article seated at my desk in my home office. When I got to the sentence about how physicians need to understand cooperation means more than just agreeing not to sabotage, I glanced around my office for my blood pressure cuff. I noticed my dog had cocked his head to one side and was studying me with some concern. Was I making some kind of guttural noises? I don't know, but I centered myself, labeled my emotion, and did a couple of deep, mindful breaths. I continued my reading, and along came the painful trope, quote, non-financial rewards and penalties also have a role to play in getting doctors on board, close quote, on board. Et tu, Brute? As I said, the main thrust of the article was how to use 4 specific motivational tools when trying to motivate doctors because, quote, physician engagement can no longer be about short-term maximization of fee-for-service revenue, close quote, ouch. Anyway, they had a nice chart with 4 healthcare systems that had been successful in engaging physicians in important projects. And the authors linked one of the 4 motivators to each of the 4 change initiatives at the various institutions. But what the authors didn't seem to notice, or at least didn't mention, was what I saw as the single most relevant factor to physician engagement. All 4 of these healthcare institutions that had been successful in engaging physicians were physician-led. Geisinger, University of Utah, Mayo, and the Cleveland Clinic all had physician CEOs. They missed that point. They missed what should have been the primary finding in the article. Why would high-profile, accomplished physicians repeat these stereotypes, whether in casual conversations or as sound bites? Well, I have a few theories. First, I don't think they've examined the statements. I don't think they ask themselves, does my medical training really conspire against me being a team player? Do physicians need incentives to do the right thing? Is my doctor's spouse a heroic lone healer or a cowboy? Number two, some of the physicians are consultants and have programs to pitch or a blog or a book to promote. And the lone wolf cowboy with no emotional intelligence who can't manage money and won't get on board is clickbait. A third reason some high-profile, accomplished physicians might use these stereotypes is that some physicians will seek to disarm their audiences and reduce the power differential with a few little aw shucks, doctor-deprecating comments. It endears them to their non-physician audience. It's kind of like saying, yeah, this brain surgery stuff, it ain't exactly rocket science. And a fourth reason, and I think this is a real minority, but some physicians have failed to get any traction in their ambitions for leadership. They haven't earned leadership credibility from their physician colleagues, and they don't get the promotions that they think they deserve. They're susceptible to becoming a shill for a non-physician CEO, but this is a subset that might repeat stereotypes because they believe them. They don't believe they've been treated fairly. A final reason, and I think an important reason, is my theory that tacit knowledge plays a role in why high-profile physician leaders repeat stereotypes. These highly accomplished physician leaders are asked about their success in becoming a physician CEO or in dealing with physicians. Or they're asked to write an article about why physicians in some organizations are willing to engage in the healthcare revolution. But they can't articulate it. They don't point to all the tacit knowledge they've amassed, informing their expert judgment and their ability to marshal the energy of their physicians, because they're not even aware that that's what's going on. So when sound bites are needed, they fish around in the readily available bucket of tropes about doctors. I must have addressed the physician's inherent lack of teamwork, or I must have applied just the right motivational technique. Jeffrey Pfeffer described a Stanford colleague of his who was frequently asked to give talks about how he managed a successful multidisciplinary center. He told Pfeffer that once, right in the middle of his talk, he thought to himself, if we actually managed the center that way, it would be a disaster. So these physicians I've called out for perpetuating stereotypes all have wheelbarrows full of credentials and accomplishments. They don't need my opinions or my approval. Nonetheless, how I'd love to add something to their 2020 New Year's resolutions, and here it is. Evaluate whether some of the labels assigned to doctors are accurate. And when characterizing physicians, particularly if you're building on a negative stereotype, use evidence. All right, and on that note, here comes part 3 of the License to Lead podcast. What is the evidence about outcomes when physicians lead? Part 3, the data about physician leadership. Amanda Goodall wrote an article in 2011 titled, Physician Leaders and Hospital Performance, Is There an Association? She analyzed the performance of U.S. News & World Report's top 100 hospitals in 3 different diagnostic categories: cancer, GI, and heart surgery. So there were 300 hospitals across these categories, and she looked to try to figure out if there was a link between physician leadership and hospital quality and financial performance. Of the 6,500 hospitals in the U.S. at the time, fewer than 5% had physician CEOs. I wrote about her findings in a September 2016 online article published on Kevin MD titled Physicians Must Lead, Here's Why. There's a link to my article and to her original article at licencetoleadpodcast.com. Goodall found that physician leadership was predictive of higher rankings, i.e., better outcomes. Of the U.S. News & World Report's highest performing hospitals, 41% were led by physician CEOs. Now, given that less than 5% of hospitals at the time had physician CEOs, You'd have to say 41% is a significant overrepresentation of physicians among the leadership of the very best hospitals. Also, the study showed that quality scores were 25% higher in physician-led institutions. In addition, U.S. News and World Reports identified an elite subset of the 21 highest-ranking institutions across all 300 hospitals. Of these 21 hospitals on the U.S. News and World Report's honor roll, 76% had physician CEOs. And while Goodall responsibly emphasized that this correlation did not prove causation, in subsequent years, she and other investigators have built an impressive case about why physician leaders are able to create better outcomes. In part 1 of this podcast, I talked about Goodall's theory of expert leadership and the multiple advantages to organizations if the top leadership, and especially the CEO, is an expert in the core business. Here's another statement from Goodall that is particularly relevant to this podcast and the next podcast, which is about professional managers. Quote, "The more managers and administrators there are in an organization, the more administrative processes there are likely to be. This may hurt innovation, adaptability, responsiveness, and the bottom line. Expert leaders are most likely to streamline managerial processes to ensure there is not an imbalance in the number of managers compared to experts." Close quote. A 2011 McKinsey collaboration with Harvard, Stanford, and the London School of Economics looked at 1,200 hospitals in 7 countries, including the U.S. The researchers already knew that certain management practices were linked to better hospital outcomes. So in this study, they wanted to figure out what would it take to get hospitals to actually use those better management practices. So what did they discover? They found 3 factors that increased the likelihood that institutions would use proven management practices. And they were competition, scale, and skills. So if the organization had a competitor, they'd shape up a little and they'd use that evidence-based management. That makes sense. And the second one, scale, which meant size, that makes sense too. In fact, they might be bigger because they'd used those good management practices. And then there's that third one, skills. What do they mean by skills? Well, you'd assume they'd be talking about business school skills, right? Management skills? Nope. The word skills ended up meaning clinical skills. So they found that hospitals with more clinicians who were managers achieved higher management practice scores across all 7 countries. They postulated that hospitals achieve better results when managers are able to, quote, speak the same language as their clinical staff, which not only enhances communication, but also allows them to enjoy a level of credibility and authority difficult to achieve for non-clinical managers, close quote. Other theories included the idea that clinicians may be able to overrule powerful incumbents, and also that these findings reflect greater trust. Hospital employees may have more confidence in a physician as their manager. And here's another study, a 2016 review of the literature by Sarto and Veronesi titled Clinical Leadership and Hospital Performance. In this one, the authors concluded that their analysis overwhelmingly supports the assumption that greater clinical presence at the strategic decision-making level improves hospital decision-making and a number of performance indicators. And another study, this one's from 2019, it was in Healthcare Management Review. And in this study, they looked at data in the 115 largest U.S. hospitals and determined that the physician-led systems had higher quality ratings across all specialties. And the authors concluded, quote, "This study suggests that physician leaders may possess skills, qualities, or management approaches that positively affect hospital quality and the value of care delivered." I took a look at the latest U.S. News and World Reports from 2018-19. I looked at their Best Hospitals Honor Roll and Googled whether the best hospital CEOs were doctors or not. So, with that in-depth statistical analysis, I determined that the trend continues. Of the 20 listed on the honor roll, it appears that 14 of the 20, or 70%, of these best of the best hospitals, according to U.S. News and World Reports, have physician CEOs. And given that the percentage of physician CEOs in the United States is still around the 5 or 6% mark of all hospital CEOs, I think it is fair to say that there is still vast overrepresentation of physician CEOs compared to non-physician CEOs on the U.S. News and World Report's honor roll. I've taught leadership programs for thousands of physicians and administrators over the years, and one huge driver for me is to reduce the number of physician leaders who feel like they were given a chief title and then thrown off a cliff. The department chief role is a common entry point, and it often has no job description, no budget, no useful orientation, and most harrowing of all, no time for the management role. Even if these newly minted chiefs are given the 0.2 FTE to be the chief of GI or thoracic surgery, often their patient responsibility doesn't actually let up. They just add more accountability. And to add an autonomy hit, they often have responsibility without authority. The chief doesn't have control of the departmental budget. He or she might even be paired with an administrative partner who is possessive of their budget and who might report in a different silo. On this topic, in a December 2017 Harvard Business Review article, Perry et al. Points to problems with the leadership dyad trend. They say that dyads can create inefficiencies and duplication of resources and delay decision-making. Quote, "The model can also create confusion about roles and spawn outright conflict. We've seen power struggles between leaders with different priorities who often issue conflicting messages to the areas they lead." Close quote. The authors recommend having a single, highly effective physician leader running the business and holding both clinical and administrative responsibilities, rather than bifurcating the role. Perry et al. Say it is more economically feasible and it reduces physician turnover and boosts morale. What I've seen is that physicians too often end up with no real administrative time, no budgetary control, or sometimes no information, and no clear administrative support to take the non-physician tasks away. If there is an executive assistant or a secretary, they often report to the administrative half of the dyad. And despite all of these logistical absurdities, the physician leader is susceptible to getting criticized or getting the big eye roll for not showing up to this or that meeting. Now, on the bright side, it's awfully compelling, given the anemic support and often non-existent leadership development, that study after study points to better outcomes when physicians lead. I mean, just think what physician leadership could look like if we actually resourced it. I mean, watch out. And while I say that with exuberance, there is a part of me thinking, careful what we wish for. What exhausting and useless array of leadership competencies might be shoveled toward physicians in their medical management skills class, or what soul-sucking measurements and analytics will be ushered over along with a robust curriculum from the local business schools. So here's a plea. Before you replicate the shrines of graduate business education for the physicians, please take a listen to my third License to Lead podcast. Now, it's inevitable, I suppose. I'll get people who interpret my comments as a blanket endorsement of any physician in any leadership position at any time. And the converse, I'll be accused of saying administrators, no matter how talented or successful, should never lead. But I'm not saying that. I can name terrific CEOs who are not clinicians. My point is that in healthcare, our ratios are screwy. They're reversed. The beloved top administrator, who is not a physician, should be the interesting exception, as we see in other traditional professions. But I am girding my loins for all the pushback and examples of leadership shortcomings of physicians. But I likely have more experience than 90% of my listeners in dealing with subpar physician leaders. My work for 20 years has been working with leaders in healthcare, a big chunk of that helping leaders improve or remove poor performers. Sadly, the first several years of my role on an executive team was heavily steeped in long overdue performance management. And it took a few years for my new approach to selecting, orienting, recognizing, and coaching to even get a toehold. My theme was physician as leader, never victim, never tyrant, and that expectation was not a fit for everyone. And as a consultant, I don't get called because everything is hunky-dory. It's because there are issues to be addressed. So no need to send me your harrowing examples of toxic physicians or lousy physician leaders. But 2 important points here. The first I've already stressed. In an industry where we're in dire straits, we know that physician leaders are better poised to lead effectively than generalists in business. I'll expand that point in podcast number 3 when we look more closely at manager generalists. My second point, to wrap up this piece on looking at the evidence of effective leadership, when we agonize about how ill-equipped physicians are to lead, when we dredge up those old stereotypes, who the heck are we comparing them to? So are all physician leaders great? No. The majority of physician leaders at any level, no doubt, leave a lot to be desired. So why do I say that? Because most leaders in every profession and industry have, shall we say, plenty of room for improvement. When someone states that physicians don't understand the marketplace or don't understand the business or are lousy leaders or lousy money managers or lousy meeting runners, I want to whirl this way and that way and say, wait a second, where is that great big old corral of outstanding, talented, effective leaders? This is such a logical failing among those who wring their hands about all the deficits in physician capability. Who are we comparing their performance to? The Gallup company provides data about the performance of managers and leaders. According to Gallup, 34% of employees in the United States are engaged, which means they're involved in and enthusiastic about their work and workplace. 53% are not engaged, not cognitively or emotionally connected to their work, happy to jump ship if any reason comes along. And the remaining, the 13%, are actively disengaged. This means they are saboteurs at work. So are we comparing physician capability to that outcome? 53% of staff not engaged and 13% are saboteurs? Are we comparing physicians to those U.S. leaders who preside over companies where, quote, 52% of employees simply don't believe senior management, close quote, according to Discovery Surveys, Inc., which surveyed over 60,000 employees? Maybe we're worried that physicians' emotional intelligence won't compare favorably to our imaginary reservoir of talent. Well, Travis Bradbury, who wrote Emotional Intelligence 2.0, states that U.S. senior executives have the lowest emotional intelligence compared to individual contributors and supervisors, managers, directors, etc. And the CEOs have the lowest emotional intelligence of all, even though emotional intelligence is one of the biggest predictors of success in a leadership role. Or, closer to home, are we comparing physician leadership potential to the current leaders in healthcare who have presided over a 44% burnout rate among physicians? These leaders who have averted their eyes at the crumbling careers and compromised mental health of physicians. Or are we comparing them to the 95% of leaders who demonstrate zero success in influencing critical strategic change, according to Joseph Grenny, one of the authors of Crucial Conversations? He looked at 1,000 leaders from 50 global companies and found that only 5% of top executives were able to effectively influence needed change in their organizations. So my point here is, let's not worry too much about whether our physician leaders can measure up to other leaders. They can. Sadly, it's not a high bar in the first place. And there are fundamental reasons, as I outlined in this podcast, to explain why physicians are better positioned to succeed. And more importantly, evidence that physician CEOs are succeeding in producing the organizational outcomes most needed in healthcare. So let's bring this puppy home with a look at action steps and what's up next. Action steps. Number 1, challenge the myths about physicians. They're inaccurate, but more importantly, they harm the cause. We need physicians to embrace leadership, and we don't need board members and others who choose the next CEO to have that background noise influencing their decisions. And when leadership is not appreciated, why would excellent physicians seek it out? according to Lowe et al., who published an article in 2016 titled Shining the Light on the Dark Side of Medical Leadership, the negative attitudes of professional colleagues toward leadership roles can actively discourage physicians from making a transition to leadership. Number 2, if you know someone in a position to influence the next CEO selection in your system, provide your perspective or send him or her a link to this podcast. And please notice and support excellent, kind, respectful leadership wherever you find it, whether physician or non-physician. The ultimate purpose is fixing healthcare, and we need all the terrific people we can find. Number 3, if you're 100% clinician or if you're a student, consider making leadership development topics 10% or so of your own continuing medical education program. Please dive in. We need you. I'll put some of my favorite leadership resources on this podcast page at licensedtoleadpodcast.com. Number 4, take on a leadership role, run for a position, or say yes if one is offered, and bring you as a physician unabashedly to the job. The most important tools we have for leadership are deeply entwined with our professional training. When someone says, and they will, just because someone's a doctor doesn't mean they know how to manage, you can recognize the truth of that. And also recognize that some experts suggest that being a physician is a necessary criteria for leadership roles in healthcare. Necessary, but of course not sufficient. There's a lot to learn. And, fortunately, physicians are learning machines. Okay, that's all I have for you as far as action steps. Next episode will be License to Lead Podcast Episode 3. So if physicians are only about 5% of the CEOs of healthcare organizations, who's leading the rest of them? What are those Masters in Business Administration and Master in Healthcare Administration degrees? Who pursues those graduate degrees? And what are the outcomes? What problems have been attributed to the business school ideology? And how might those problems contribute to the straits we're in healthcare? After that one will be License to Lead Podcast Episode 4, and that one will be about physician career and burnout evaluated in part from a neuroscience perspective. So once again, thank you. I'm beside myself with appreciation that you're listening. Thank you for all the care and caring you bring to your patients and to the community. And for listeners who are not in medicine, thank you for caring about the medical profession and the health and well-being of our fellow humans. To learn more about how we work with physicians and other leaders to create healthy work cultures, or to join in the conversation for future podcasts, go to licensedtoleadpodcast.com, where you can send me an email or leave me a voice message.